Hi, I'm Harry KOPP. I'm the author of this book, Career Diplomacy, Life and Work in the Foreign Service, which is a book primarily for prospective candidates for the Foreign Service. There's an interesting story behind the publication of Career Diplomacy. There's a foundation in Washington called the Una Chapman Cox Foundation, which is dedicated to building a strong foreign service. General Jack Galvin, a former commander of U.S. forces in Europe, joined the policy committee of that foundation, and the first question he asked is, where's the book? Where's the book that tells me what I need to know about the Foreign Service? Well, said the other members, there is no such book. He said, that can't be. There's an Army officer's guide, there's a Navy officer's guide. Where's the book for the Foreign Service? Well, one of the members of the policy committee, Tony Gillespie, said, there should be such a book, and I know the fellow to write one. Tony Gillespie was a friend of mine from our days together in the Foreign Service, and he recruited me to work with him to produce the first edition of the book, which we did in 2008. Unfortunately, Tony died just before the book was published in its first edition, but the book went on to some success, enough success so that the publisher was eager to have a second edition done. That's the book you see over here, published earlier this year. The manuscript for the first edition was completed at the end of 2007. A lot has changed since then. Of course, we've had an election. We have new leadership at the Department of State with a new approach to management and different ideas about the Foreign Service. We have a different situation in the world, which has changed deployment of the Foreign Service, reduction in Iraq of people in the field, and a standing up of consulates where there were provincial reconstruction teams, the introduction of many more civilian personnel into Afghanistan, and changes in the budget. We had an expansion of the budget in 2008, 2009, 2010, followed by a budget crunch, the effects of which we haven't yet seen. So there's a lot that has changed, and we wanted to capture that in a second edition. So we brought all of the numbers up to date from 2007 to 2011. We discussed the new issues confronting the service and discussed the management approach of the new leadership. The Foreign Service has a triple mission. It's involved in representation of the United States, which includes negotiation and persuasion and reporting of what's going on in the world and analysis of that information. It's involved in operations, by which I mean running programs, actually getting things done, administering U.S. laws overseas, like as the Consular Service does with the visa provisions of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And at its senior levels in particular, it's involved with policy, with advising the politically appointed leadership of the Department of State and of the executive branch on what U.S. policy ought to be, what U.S. interests are, and what policies are most likely to defend and advance those interests. I don't want to say, and couldn't say, that one of those functions is more important than the others. I think a Foreign Service officer, no matter what his work or her work, is involved in all three of those areas, sometimes more in one than the other. But that's what a Foreign Service does: representation, operations, and policy. Well, the Foreign Service always faces some of the same challenges, which is to represent the United States abroad in what, after all, are always challenging times. There's never never an easy period for foreign policy. Dean Rusk, who was Secretary of State under Kennedy and Johnson, used to say that the trouble with foreign policy was that 2/3 of the world was always awake, making trouble for the third that's asleep. And that's as true today as it was 50 years ago. There are some specific challenges in the current period that haven't existed so much in the past. And the principal challenge is that of what is sometimes called expeditionary diplomacy. A few years ago, in 2003, 2004, 2005, the U.S. began to deploy diplomats in large numbers in areas of intense conflict, particularly in Iraq, not in safe and secure embassies, but out in the field, trying to build political systems at the local level and to strengthen economic growth and development at a local level. This was really a new task for the Foreign Service. It had absorbed a lot of energy, a lot of attention. Initially, a lot of mistakes were made. There have been some lessons learned. And adapting to that challenge, first in Iraq, and now more in Afghanistan, has been a major task of the Foreign Service. Where the Foreign Service heads depends to a large extent on where U.S. foreign policy goes. It's really impossible to say whether the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan is likely to be repeated, or whether that experience will fade into history and the service will return to more traditional diplomatic techniques and pursuits. If what has been done in Iraq and Afghanistan, in fact, is a pattern for the future, then the service will have to become comfortable with sending large numbers of people into very challenging environments without their families for long periods of time. And we'll have to train people to do this, to learn the languages that they need to know. If in fact that turns out not to be the case, and the U.S. doesn't repeat that kind of experience, or for whatever reason decides not to employ the diplomatic service to do that kind of work, then the Foreign Service, as I say, will return to a more traditional kind of representation, and will adapt accordingly. When Secretary Clinton came in, she developed a program to expand the Foreign Service by 25% over a 5-year period, from the end of fiscal year 2008 to the end of fiscal year 2013. That would have been a growth from about 11,000 to roughly, well, let's see, that's to roughly 14,000. Through the end of fiscal year 2010, an increase of about 15% has been put in place. People have been hired and sworn in. But as everyone knows, the budget for continuing this expansion is not likely to be secured from the Congress, and indeed is probably not likely to be requested by the administration. So this expansion program, which the Secretary called Diplomacy 3.0 for Diplomacy, Development, and Defense, is certainly in suspense and possibly at an end. We will have for the next several years a Foreign Service of about roughly 14,000 people in the Department of State, and about 60% of them Foreign Service officers, 40% of them Foreign Service specialists. That's where the Foreign Service is likely to be for some years to come. This question is often asked, and it's a concern that these days that If the Republicans get control of the Congress, the Foreign Service will find its budget sharply reduced. And that fear comes from a perception that, as former Secretary of State Al Haig said, the Foreign Service is not a Republican institution. And in fact, there's a lot to that. These days, and it wasn't always the case, but these days the Republican Party, more than the Democratic Party, represents, oddly enough, both the idealistic and the internationalist strains in American foreign policy, American thinking. By idealist, I mean that the Republicans, probably more than the Democrats, favor the idea that U.S. foreign policy should promote American political and moral values, even at the expense, or at least the short-term expense, of American interests. By a unilateralist, I mean an isolationist. I mean that Republicans, more than the Democrats, are willing to see the United States pursue policies that other nations do not support, or to withdraw from engagement in foreign affairs. Foreign Service officers are internationalists. They do not tend to see international issues in moral terms. They tend to see them in political and strategic terms. They do not want to withdraw. They want to engage whenever possible. And this will put the Foreign Service at odds with the idealistic and isolationist strains in American thought, which, as I say, are, at this period in American history, are represented more in the Republican than in the Democratic Party. So those tensions are real. I don't think it's going to affect the budget, not a nickel's worth. But the tension is certainly there. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, as I've mentioned, have taken Foreign Service officers out of their usual career paths and put many of them into the field to do work at a local level in building political institutions, primarily economic institutions as well. Working very closely with the U.S. military, working with USAID, working with NGOs, but particularly with the U.S. military, and developing new relationships with the military under very difficult conditions, which the military is providing security for the civilians. That relationship with the U.S. military is perhaps a major change in the Foreign Service that's going to persist even if, in fact, the U.S. does not repeat the Iraq and Afghanistan experience in the future. The effort to maintain a close relationship between the diplomats and the military, that effort is certainly going to continue. It's been a real struggle in Iraq and Afghanistan to build confidence on both sides, but I think it's safe to say that a lot of progress has been made. Now, that's a very interesting question. The American Foreign Service Association, which is the professional association of Foreign Service professionals, and also the union to which Foreign Service officers belong, and represents them in labor management negotiations. They took a survey of other foreign services. They looked at, let's see, the UK, France, Germany, Canada, China, India, Mexico, and Brazil. And they found that the U.S. service is unique in a number of ways. I think most importantly, the U.S. service is unique in hiring. The U.S. does not require its entering officers to have any particular kind of credential. All the other services require entrants to have completed a degree in international affairs or political science or economics some other area of relevance to the service. The U.S. has no such requirement. Other countries require their entering officers to have a command of at least one foreign language. The U.S. service has no such requirement. The U.S. service does have, again, uniquely, an extraordinary program of language training, not only in critical languages that are in short supply, like Arabic and Chinese and Korean, Urdu, but also in world languages like Russian or French or Spanish. In fact, they teach about 80 languages, and they teach them well. That's really uniquely a unique feature of the U.S. service. The U.S. has the biggest service. It's in the most countries, has the most posts, and so the U.S. has opportunities that other countries don't have to make its officers specialize in certain areas. Our personnel system divides the Foreign Service into several cones. There are political officers, economic officers, management officers, consular officers, and public diplomacy officers. And people in those specialties or cones stay largely in those areas throughout a career. No other service has anything remotely like that. Some other countries, Brazil in particular, but not only Brazil, work hard at placing Foreign Service officers in other ministries to run their international departments. This builds important links and probably increases the bureaucratic clout of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The U.S. doesn't do that and may suffer accordingly. I would say that other diplomatic services have a very high regard for the quality of the work done by the U.S., and this came to light after the WikiLeaks affair, when so many U.S. diplomatic cables were exposed to public view. One diplomat from the European Union read a number of classified U.S. cables and wrote, said, compared to this, our reports are crap. So the U.S. reports they have analysis, they have information, they show a quality of understanding and a quality of style that's almost literary. They set the benchmark. Nice to hear. It's a tough way to earn that kind of praise, but it was nice to hear. Well, I was a diplomat a fairly long time ago. I left the Foreign Service in 1985. But the story I most often repeat occurred, in fact, a decade before that, when I was serving in Poland. And, Senator Humphrey came to Poland to dedicate a hospital in Krakow, for which he had, as a senator, helped to procure some U.S. funding. I say Senator Humphrey. He was in the Senate after his time as vice president. He was near the end of his career, and in fact, not far from the end of his life. I was assigned to accompany him on his trip, and on the return from Krakow, we were traveling by train from Krakow to Warsaw, a trip that's normally just a few hours, but a breakdown on the track ahead of us caused our train to stall and then to creep at 3 or 4 miles an hour on this long journey. We were in a sealed car at the end of the train because the Polish authorities, of course, this is the People's Republic of Poland. This is a communist country, and the authorities did not want Senator Humphrey to mingle with others on the train. So his party was sealed off. We ran out of food. We ran out of liquid. We were there for many, many hours. And, at one point, I was able to get outside the car and hang along the side of the train like a character in a James Bond movie and make my way to the dining car, fetch beer and potato chips for the party. And we sat around inside that car with our beer and potato chips, playing penny ante poker. for hours and hours listening to Senator Humphrey tell his political stories. I say we were a group of Minnesota journalists and friends of the senator and his doctor. The stories that Humphrey told, wonderful stories. He was filled with energy. He spoke as volubly and as fast as all of the caricatures of him indicated, full of optimism and energy. It was, I like to say that the time with Senator Humphrey was an antidote to cynicism. It was a wonderful experience and one that I carry with me always. The advice, obviously, is to read the book, which will do a great deal to help any prospective candidate understand not only what it's like to be in the Foreign Service, but what the Foreign Service does, what challenges it confronts, what the profession of diplomacy is all about, what the institutions that the United States has created to manage foreign affairs, what they are, how they work, and how they affect the people who work inside. If you're in the Foreign Service, if you're thinking about joining the Foreign Service, you are almost certainly more interested in international affairs than the average American. You are more curious about foreigners. You're more tolerant of foreigners. You want to live among foreigners. You're interested in what they have to say. You're interested in their views. You see the world in a complex way, more so than your countrymen. I'm not trying to say that's good or bad, but Foreign Service officers certainly are more internationalist than the average. If you want to join the Foreign Service, you really need to have a commitment to working overseas, learning foreign languages, working sometimes in difficult conditions. You need to understand that your work is not likely to be much appreciated by your countrymen at home, including often by your close relatives who will not understand precisely what it is you do and won't be nearly as interested in it as you think they should be. So it's a different kind of life. People who do join the Foreign Service tend to stay in it. Very few people leave. Retention rates are high. So if you do join the Foreign Service, the odds are you will be in the service for 20 years or more. FSOs can retire at age 50 if they have 20 years of service, and they must retire at age 65. That's a mandatory retirement age. Many FSOs who retire kind of stick around. There's a program called WAE for when actually employed, in which retired FSOs come back, and if they've retained their security and medical clearance, they come back and work for the Department of State. Those who really cut the cord, well, they take all kinds of jobs. Many go into writing or teaching or research, usually with academic institutions or with think tanks like the Center for Strategic and International Studies or the Brookings Institution or the Carnegie Endowment. Some work for non-governmental organizations or charities that have an international focus, maybe in refugee affairs, for example, or international environmental issues. Some go into business or banking, a few go into journalism or politics, yes, some in politics, not too many, but some. So really there's quite a wide range of opportunity.